This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, when folks go to the French Quarter Festival this weekend, the good news is that many drivers can access the neighborhood quickly by the interstate that runs alongside it. The bad news is that there is an interstate that runs alongside it. Some festival goers might get to the festivities by public transit, where the growth, like the rides, has had many starts and stops. We'll be looking at the condition of the quarter tonight, as well as the issues that surround it. And so that the music will continue, we will examine the local quality of music education. We'll also take a special look at the condition of the regional office market and at the basketball Pelicans, whose season took flight this week. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Stephanie Regal, staff writer, The Times-Picayune, The New Orleans Advocate; Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter; and Carly Berlin, Metro reporter, WWNO Radio. And Carly, we're going to stay with you because as Errol writes about in the lead-in regarding that interstate that runs alongside it with this Claiborne overpass, which of course had been, decades ago, a beautiful oak tree-lined boulevard, and then that elevated, expressway went over there. And so there are sort of mixed feelings about what to do with that, and that's what you've looked into.
Yeah, absolutely. So folks might remember that a couple years ago, the Biden White House specifically called out Claiborne as an example of a highway that was built through a predominantly black neighborhood in the 1960s. And he used that, or the White House used that as a way to sort of launch this new,
Keep
all
going.
good. The White House has launched this new program called Reconnecting Communities. And the whole idea behind it is putting funding towards projects that stitch together neighborhoods that have been harmed by highways like Claiborne in the past.
Yeah.
And our State Department of Transportation here just got a cut of this new money. They got $500,000 for a project to sort of reimagine Claiborne, though, as you can imagine, that is a very small chunk of money for this big vision for what
They were
they're hoping
seeking
to
how
do.
much?
They were seeking, it's a $95 million budget. They were hoping the program would cover half that cost. So this is a very, very small fraction of that.
So what is the sentiment of the folks who live in that area? As you said, that it was in the late 60s when it all changed there, when those beautiful trees were ripped up and then the elevated, the overpass went through it to be part of the interstate system and, improved transit, that's for sure, but it really disrupted the neighborhood. Fast forward several decades and there was thought, okay, let's tear down that expressway and bring it back to that beautiful neighborhood. But not everybody, surprisingly, to some, felt that way because this has really become a community center.
No, that's definitely true. And I will say the people that I talked to for this story, some of older folks grew up remembering, what Claiborne as this beautiful boulevard was like. And of course, people have come to really embrace the area under the highway as the sort of community space too. The vision that the state and the city have is to really put a lot of money into fixing up the highway itself. They wanted to put, most of that $95 million towards maintenance work, fixing lights, fixing drainage, things like that. They also wanted to, potentially look at removing some of the on and off ramps that slice down into the Tremé and, pose some real safety threats if you're a pedestrian or you're on a bike trying to cross Claiborne, the surface street. And they also wanted to put a chunk of that money into building out a sort of more formal public space under the underpass. So things like creating performance stages, public market stalls, things like that. And I should say, too, there are a lot of people in the neighborhood who still want to see the highway removed, who really feel like the only way to sort of heal the harms that it's caused is to remove it. And there was another proposal to reconnecting communities that was actually from a nonprofit group. Their idea was to do, sort of some more studying, some more planning, some more community engagement. And their vision was, through that whole process, removing the highway would be the option that would win out. They didn't end up getting any funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And so we sort of don't know exactly what's going to happen next here.
So go ahead, Dee. I'm sorry.
Well, during that period of time, the whole interstate and freeway system was starting all around the country. And part of the plan was to build a loop going into a city, into the old part of the city. And so to go into the old part of the city is by definition an older part of the city, and it's nearer your transportation arteries like the river or the railroad track. So just practicality, I know people have to talk about the racial angle too, but just practicality, that's a place. I mean, you could have built it down Galvez, you could have built it down Broad Street, but that was further away from downtown. And so that was faced all over. It was facing Boston and in Los Angeles. They had those kind of issues. I always think anytime you drive to the Gulf Coast and you go through Mobile, like the interstate goes right through the old part of town.
It does.
I mean, right in the middle of town. And so that was the thing that people were facing. Yes, blacks had less political power at the time too, and so they really didn't maybe have a chair to debate. But there was a practical issue that was involved in it. But I know one thing they were talking about earlier was boulevards. How would boulevards have been a substitute?
Yeah, and I have focused less on this in my reporting, so I will answer as best I can. But there was a whole planning process that happened about a decade ago, and I think that's what you're referring to. That was had some federal funding go into it as well, and they came out with these different scenarios for taking down parts of the interstate or keeping it there, and some of those options revolved around really returning Claiborne to that boulevard. There is the question, of course, of where does the traffic go if you take the highway away? I think some folks see 610 as an option. I think there's also the question of, do you introduce more traffic onto surface streets around the neighborhood?
It would not be an easy thing to do.
Sure,
that's for sure, to make that kind of big change. And we should note around that time also was the proposal for an elevated riverfront expressway right in front of St. Louis Cathedral along the French Quarter. That was canceled. That did not happen. So do you think, is the talk now sort of tamped down in terms of removing it and focused more on just improving it and, underneath for the community?
I think on the local and state government side, that seems to be the tack that they're taking. I think on the community side, there is a split. There are people who would really like to see it removed ultimately. And who say, this is an aging structure, it causes noise pollution, it causes air pollution, a lot of other problems like that. All
right, Carly, thanks a lot. Stephanie, over to you. Office space in the metro area. Are people moving back into their offices?
Well, it's an interesting thing. We still don't really know how many bodies are downtown or in Metairie in the office towers, because whatever the lease rates show, which is between 80 and 85%, probably only half to 2/3 of the workers are actually coming back to the office on a full-time basis. So that's a question that I think needs further study, and I think it would be really interesting. But one of the latest office market report that came out earlier this week from Corporate Realty shows that by and large, the lease rates are holding fairly steady in the big Class A office towers downtown and the big Class A office buildings in East Metairie as well. Slightly down from last year, but maybe 82%, 83% compared to 84% last year, which would be in keeping with post-pandemic trends, as companies reevaluate. Also, the lease rates are holding fairly steady. They're right around $20 per square foot for the downtown buildings and a little bit higher in Metairie, closer to $24 a square foot because of the parking, right? You don't have the parking issue, so they're able to charge more. So that sounds good. And I mean, part of the good part is that big law firms here, which really drive the tenant space down there, they're re-upping. They like having people in the office. So like Jones Walker, for instance, recently re-upped a long-term lease for 115,000 square feet in Place St. Charles. The downside and the other side, the flip side of this coin is that the reason that the rates are holding fairly steady is just because even though the numbers aren't strong on the occupancy, there's no new inventory. We haven't had any new buildings built in the city in 30 years. And at the same time, we've actually lost a lot of the older buildings, which have been repurposed as condos and apartments. So you've had a tremendous shrinkage in the amount of buildings, and even still the lease rates are high. So I mean, the problem is there just are not a lot of new companies, and therefore a lot of people coming into the market.
And that's in
people
Orleans,
are what drives real estate.
Right, that's in the city, in New Orleans.
It's
What about
in the city.
outer
so,
areas?
so I mean, Metairie is a little stronger. I mean, you see more growth out there, and part of it, like I said, is just convenience. People want to be maybe in Metairie because they can park, and they don't have to charge their employees to pay for parking, so it's more desirable. It's perceived it's safer. And then, for instance, along that corridor of Causeway and Vets, that's a really, really popular retail corridor. So it's convenient, there's a lot of shopping, there's a lot of amenities, and you're around a lot of residential properties. So those areas are doing fairly well. St. Tammany is super strong right now, 96% occupancy. Of course, they don't have as many buildings. I mean, it's still primarily a bedroom community, but most of the growth we've seen in the office sector over the past 10 years has come from St. Tammany Parish.
So essentially what you're saying is that we're seeing that companies, businesses are holding on to their office space and re-upping it.
Yeah.
But we really don't know how many people are going in there and actually filling those spaces.
No, and
yet.
I think to figure that out, you'd really have to almost do a parking census of the parking garages to really get an idea. I talked to Mike Siegel at Corporate Realty a few months ago and asked him that question. He said roughly 2/3 is the number that they're using. So 2/3 of 80%, say, which would be mid-50s, So what does that mean for the surrounding businesses, the lunch places or the shoe shine places or dry cleaners or whoever used to feed off of office workers, for their livelihood? And you can see, especially being downtown, the composition of what used to be a central business district is so completely different. So I just marvel at it.
Although we are still different from other markets. There are, the bigger cities where their office space is just dying and people aren't coming back to work and they've figured out they don't need to be in the office and the companies aren't demanding it. I think here our companies are saying, you're going to be in the office at least a few times a week.
Right.
We're going to see faces. We're going to meet around a table.
And part of that, I mean, the promoters say, well, New Orleans is a sociable place. People like to be around each other. Maybe that's true to an extent. I mean, I think the bigger driver is the fact that most of the big tenants downtown are law firms. And it makes sense for them to be in the office more. We don't have as many tech companies, and the tech companies we do have that make big announcements about moving here, like one big tech company announced a couple of weeks ago they were moving in, and there was a big announcement from the economic development folks. They're renting a co-working space. You know what that means? That means they're not bringing any people here.
Right.
I mean, maybe they have people on their payroll somewhere else, but they're not leasing office space. I mean, a co-working space is like they're working at a table somewhere,
Sharing a kitchen and a bathroom with someone else.
Right. So do we have any actual office buildings on the horizon in Orleans forthcoming?
No,
Or you
no
hear of
office
hotels.
buildings being constructed, no. And if you see any cranes in the sky, it's more than likely a hotel or apartments. There haven't been any office building sales. Nationally, of course, investors are starting to really shy away from office buildings. But notably, Frank Stewart has put Heritage Plaza on the market. That's a big building right at the 17th Street Canal. There's another older Metairie office building, Executive Tower, which has recently been renovated. There's talk that Frank Stewart may also sell the DXC Technology Building at 1615 Poydras. But again, that's if they can find buyers. And buyers are sort of, Canal Place, the office building portion of it, was on the market last year, and they took it off because they didn't have any interest.
Also, what you're not seeing in downtowns that you used to see is big department stores.
No.
They don't exist. I guess maybe Canal Place to a certain extent. And they were replaced by the shopping centers. And now the shopping centers are kind of shaky too.
The shopping centers are kind of shaky too. We heard at a UNO real estate forum last week, that retail is hanging on. It really depends on the location. So like I said, that Metairie corridor, Vets and Causeway, super, super strong. Magazine Street. I mean, in last year, an example was the Whole Foods building sold for $31 million. That's a huge number. That's California prices, as somebody said at the real estate forum. But again, it speaks to a wealthy corridor with a lot of shoppers. So there are pockets of health and pockets of activity, but it's certainly not across the board at all.
Right. All righty. Well, let's talk about the French Quarter. Thanks a lot, Steph. And Yarrow, you wanted to talk about how the French Quarter was doing.
Yeah, well, what I always say about the French Quarter is the French Quarter is not what it used to be, but it never is what it used to be. I mean, it's always in some kind of transaction, and some of what it used to be. That I mean, it's better now. One thing that New Orleans gets a lot of credit for was creating. It started in the 1920s and it was finalized like around 1935. The Vieux Carré Commission.
Right.
That was the first neighborhood historic district protection agency in the country. And it did a good job over time. And so you can still go in the French Quarter and you could still see a lot of what was. And so an example of what could have been, though, or might have been, it's not terrible, but it's an example of if you look at the building now known as the Supreme Court building, that was, there used to be two city blocks there.
Right.
And that was torn down, I think, in the 1920s, but before the Vieux Carré Commission came into existence. And there was a lot of flack over that. There was a lot of work. It was torn down to build that building. They built it, and then the Supreme Court moved away, and eventually came back. But, you know, some people say it's good to have judges right there, and maybe it is. But at the same time, it's a departure from what it is. But the problem is it's not family-oriented anymore. I mean, you don't have kids growing up in the French Quarter. You do have a good population base, but it's more of a Greenwich Village sort of a population base. The French Quarter survives with tourism, which happens in a lot of cities, and there are some things that are really just great. I mean, you know, the great restaurants and museums and things. There are some problem areas. One problem area that I see, just my own survey, is like around the front of the quarter, like around Bienville Street. You go at night, and there's a lot of that crowd, like going from the music clubs. It's really loud. People who are buying daiquiris, you know, on the street corner, and these guys will go around these motorcycles that make a loud noise. And so, in a place where you want to hear jazz coming down the streets, you know, it's difficulty. But then there's still other places. You know, you walk down the street and you smell mayonnaise being cooked in Café Lane. So there's a lot of it that's endured and survived. I think the French Quarter Festival has done a lot to help preserve and make people appreciate it. Because I think one thing they wanted to do was to get New Orleanians back into the French Quarter who never go. They didn't want them to spend all their time in Metairie and just be people from out of town. And so I think it's helping with that.
Well, definitely the crowds have grown each year, you know, and they're expecting big crowds again this year. And of course, the folks go down there to enjoy not only the ambiance of the quarter, but a lot of good music. Spread all around and good food too.
And it's creating work for the musicians too.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
The other thing that's kind of spilling over is the growth along Frenchman Street. You know, across Esplanade and all that. I think that's making part of the whole French Quarter neighborhood stronger. Okay.
And so, as we were just talking about French Quarter Fest means music too, and that leads over to you now, Dawn. How are we keeping our music alive?
Well, French Quarter Fest and Jazz Fest, which we're in music festival season for sure, they definitely help keep the spotlight on music in a lot of ways. They're bringing the performers in or hiring locals. French Quarter Fest, a lot of locals playing music, sitting in with bands, and a lot of local children and not children listening in who hear something and then want to go see if they can do it too. So it begs the question, what is music learning like in the city of New Orleans right now? And we have some definitive timelines in music education in New Orleans. The pre-Katrina, post-Katrina, and now pre-COVID, post-COVID, both of which really rocked the scene of music education. When the schools, with Katrina, it wasn't so much the damage to the city, it was more the restructuring completely of the schools into an almost all charter system, and a school system where test scores became crucially important, and the arts kind of, they often take a back seat to the academics, and schools starting to relearn how to do it and how to teach music. You know, in the old days, a lot of the jazz was learned on the streets or following along the second line or listening in, and it still happens a lot that way. You listen in and hear it. The KIPP schools, I'm told by a UNO professor, do a really good job at music. We have the schools that are dedicated to music, like NOCA, obviously, still churning out musicians and great ones at that. The former Lusher School, Willow, now students have to pick an art and pursue that art while they're there. So music education is still definitely happening, just maybe not in quite the same ways. And then COVID hit, and all music stopped, not just here, around the nation. No kids could go into a room and blow into a horn or use their voices and sing because we were all masked. Some tried to do it outside. Only time will tell what this COVID break did to music education, because, did it catch a 5th grader when they would have first been picking up that horn who no longer could pick up that horn? So it's hard to tell, but our universities and their music scene are thriving. We're a relatively small city by size, but we have Loyola, UNO, Xavier, and Tulane, all with thriving, healthy, and very different music departments. At Loyola, they have a music business degree, and they've been named one of the top music business degrees in the country, with the likes of Berklee School of Music in Boston. UNO has their jazz studies program, and they really have the artists in residence where you can go see your professors playing on the weekends, and they'll sit in and play together. Xavier, everyone has their own niche with music programs, so we still are a hotbed of producing music, learning music. I learned in this research that up until last year, did you know that the playing of and dancing to jazz music in New Orleans schools was banned?
Wow.
It was banned in 1922 because it was inappropriate. That ban was mostly ignored. And it was officially, thank God it was ignored, because jazz really did get its birthplace. But as of last year, that ban is officially off the books.
All right, efforts still underway to grow the music business industry here as well.
Yes.
Yeah, the music continues to be played, thank goodness. Carly, let's go on over to you. Public transit in the city of New Orleans. There is now there's an approved route, but it's not going to start for a while yet. Tell us about that in the city.
Yeah, so the Regional Transit Authority wants to build this new thing called a bus rapid transit line. We don't have any true rapid transit in our whole region here, and the cost of building new train lines, city train lines, has gotten exorbitantly expensive. And so what a lot of cities are turning to is this thing, bus rapid transit. Basically, the goal of it is to get the speed of having a rail system without the cost of having to build a new rail system. The way that it often works is having dedicated bus lanes, priority signals at traffic lights, fewer stops so buses can pick up speed as they go through town. And the RTA wants to build a line from Algiers through downtown out to New Orleans East. And they basically, the news is that last month the city council gave them the green light on that route, basically just saying what streets it will take, not the specifics like where stops will go and things like that. But there was a point of contention, which is how will taking these buses over the Crescent City Connection Bridge look? So Council Member Freddie King, who represents Algiers, delayed this vote originally back in February over concern that, he's heard from his constituents about, potentially increasing traffic, increasing congestion if you, dedicate a bus lane on the bridge. Now, the RTA has been very clear that no decisions have been made for how getting these buses over the bridge will ultimately look.
So basically, council said, okay, go ahead and try to get the money for it.
Exactly. So now the RTA will be applying for federal transit money, this pool of money that's, gotten a big influx from the infrastructure bill as well. And, they're moving forward with planning now, but they, are hoping to get this money to actually help build this thing. And if they do get it in time, what they're saying is they'll have buses on the road at earliest in 2027. So we've got a ways.
Yeah, still a lot more planning to do with it too. Okay, Carly, thanks a lot. E, over to you. Well, Pelican season has ended.
There was a game in November where the Pelicans played the Golden State Warriors, who were the defending champions and who'd won the championship like 2 or 3 times. And they played them here in New Orleans. And the Pelicans beat Golden State by 45 points that night. Wow. And that night, everybody said, man, here's the team of the future. We're on the way right now. And Zion played, the whole team was together. And it really didn't go much further than that. People started getting hurt. And our friend Jeff Duncan had a column in The Advocate talking about how the New Orleans fans have a right to be disappointed. Like in the last couple of years, Michael Thomas, the star receiver for the Saints, has pretty much sat out 2 seasons in a row. And Zion Williamson, from whom there was so much hope, did the same thing. I mean, he barely played, and you got to think he would have made a difference because, the Saints barely didn't get into the playoffs, and he could have. A writer for ESPN was writing and saying, look, don't get rid of Zion. I mean, I know you all are discouraged, but he's your future here. I did talk to someone who was kind of close to the situation, and he told me, we're talking about, Zion had a hamstring, and to me that was like a fairly routine thing, but he says, but it's very complicated, it's very complex. I didn't know what he meant. Now I think I know what he meant. I think there's a lot mental going on too, because he made some comments this week. I'm okay physically, but I don't know if I'm there. I mean, he was talking about himself in third person. I'm not feeling like Zion right now, and so I think the body's okay. But then we may need to work with the mental side. Pelicans have some good players and really bright players, and a guy like C.J. McCollum, just really, really smart. He's a great player, but he's also the head of the Players Association, so he knows all these kind of players' issues and that sort of thing. And I think they're people that maybe they could work with, and they have a good coach, and so they just have a lot of mental block building to do between now and next season.
Okay, just hope and patience, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, E, other stories, keep with you.
Okay, I know we usually talk about the future, but in deference to Corley, a quick anecdote from the past, okay? There was a movie that came out in 1969 called Easy Rider, and this was about these motorcycle riders that come to New Orleans from Mardi Gras. Anyway, there's a scene there in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. They've had exposure to a lot of drugs, and so they're kind of on a high with a couple of women. But anyway, while this is going on, in the background you hear this noise, this pounding noise, and you see some sort of activity. What that was, with the expressway was being built, it was actually being built that day, right?
Kidding.
Yeah, and so if you're, I mean, a lot of other days too, if ever you see that movie, that moment is captured in that famous scene from Easy Rider.
That's a great
So
story.
it was 68.
That really is.
Awesome.
Steph, over to you.
Well, following a story that we reported on yesterday about some employees at Oxnard, mostly nurses, including, we think, some LSU nursing students who made a TikTok video that went viral and got them into a lot of trouble. It was to the lyrics of a very obscene and vulgar rap song, and they did this in the hospital with using hospital equipment and props to make obscene gestures, and it sort of speaks to challenges that workplaces have.
So is that
with
wrong?
These videos? That is wrong.
It was against regulations, right? Yeah.
Clearly, and it just shows you how pervasive this social media is, and like they wouldn't even stop to think, whoa.
Maybe I shouldn't do this
Not
at work.
a good idea.
All right, Don, over to you.
Happy sports news. For the second time in 2 weeks, LSU women are competing for a national title. The LSU gymnasts go for the national title tomorrow.
Very exciting. Carly, over to you.
We have a new environmental podcast out called Sea Change. We've got our first couple of episodes out, and all my time right now is working on an episode that's going to come out later next month.
Okay, we'll be looking for that, to hear it, the WWNO. Yeah. Okay, guys, thanks so much for being here. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.